Good morning. Can I welcome everyone to this, the 20th meeting of the Justice Committee in 2013. Seems like a lifetime with the work we've had. One more week to go, committee. Can I ask everyone to switch off mobile phones and other electronic devices completely as they interfere with the broadcasting system, even when switched to silent. Apologies have been received by David McCletchie and Alison McInnes. John Lamont is attending as a substitute for David. We must congratulate them both for being honoured. You see what happens when you come on this committee? You end up with honours. Well, some of us do. Anyway.
One of our panellists as well.
Two of our panellists. So, one of our panellists as well. Who else has got one? Is it Ms Duncan?
John Duffy.
John Duffy. OBE. That's 3 people. Well, you see how this committee really obviously must have some golden touch. Anyway, item 1, I'm asking the committee if you'd be prepared to take items 6 and 7 in private. Item 6 is consideration of our approach to the scrutiny of a legislative consent memorandum for the Anti-Social Behaviour, Crime and Policing Bill. It's proposed as a private item as we will be discussing possible individuals and organisations that we may ask to inform our consideration of the LCM. Are you agreed? Item 7 is an item on our work programme. As usual with the work programme, it would be helpful if we allow the clerks, to provide input during our consideration of this item. Are you agreed to take item 7 in private? Yes. Thank you. Item 2, Police and Fire Reform Scotland Act 2012, implementation of the fire provisions, and this is an evidence session on that bill. And I welcome to the meeting our first panel, John Duffy, Scottish Secretary, FBU, Sarah Duncan, Regional Organiser Unison, and Nick Croft, Corporate Policy and Strategy Manager, City of Edinburgh Council. Questions, please, members? I've got Rod, and then I've got John Finney, and then I've got Sandra White. Okay.
Morning, panel. Just in relation to the number of control rooms, perhaps you could share with us your current thinking on whether the number of control rooms can be reduced.
Now, who would like to answer that? If you just nominate, I'll indicate who's taking that one. Mr Duffy, your microphone should come on automatically, and then I'll take Sarah Duncan.
I think, good morning panel, morning committee. I think the technical answer to your question is that you can have any number of control rooms. The way that the technology works currently is you could locate your control room any place in the world, and it could still function. The actual question is how best do you get your control to function? One of the things that we are looking at the moment is the imbalance between the number of calls and the workload that is handled in one control room as compared with another. There's considerable work being done at the moment, of which on which the Fire Brigade Union is contributing to that work. Looking at the technical aspects, looking at where you would have to locate controls. You may want to consider the resilience, you may want to consider security, you may want to consider not having them in residential areas, you may want to consider not having them attached to fire stations particularly, you may want them away from your headquarters. So there is a huge scope in deciding how best to facilitate the operations of the service. And it's important to note that our control rooms are not a call centre. They are a command and control function. They are an integral part of the fire and rescue service and an integral part of our capabilities. The key for the Fire Brigade Union is achieving a technical answer that then balances the needs of our members to allow them to continue to deliver the quality of service that we've currently got. And I'm encouraged by the way that the work is being developed, where we're looking at the resources that we've got technically, we're looking at the people that we've got, we're looking at where they're located, where they live, how we can the scope that you've then got for moving around the country and where that would be located. So that's perhaps a long-winded answer to you can have any number that you want. The key for us is to get the right number, and I'm content that at the moment the work that is being done in a way that will produce that.
Ms Duncan.
I think any decision about how many control rooms you need has to be evidence-based, but a key part of that evidence is the skills and experience of the staff that already staff the control rooms. It's very easy to say that there's duplication, but it's difficult to duplicate experience, and that's what you've got in this staff group at the moment. Any decision to reduce the number of control rooms may adversely impact on more than 100 people, and that has to be taken into account, because you can't have the disruption to the service that you would have if you upset that many people or made them lose their jobs or demanded that an awful lot of them move. I agree with John. Unison 2 is involved in the process of looking at control rooms, and we're satisfied that the right elements are being looked at and that the right weight will be given to decisions made about where the control room should be located in the future.
What do you want to ask?
No, that's fine.
Thank you very
Yeah,
much.
yeah.
Don Finney, John.
Thank you, Convener. Morning, panel. Excuse me. I'd like to ask the panel if there's been any issues connected with the move to a single police service. I mean, if there are any particular issues for the fire and rescue service, but also if there's been any issues regarding your collaborative working with the police service.
Yes, Mr. Crawford.
My function in the City Council is to manage the community planning arrangements, so we have a lot of dealings with police and fire service locally. Whilst it's been an unprecedented amount of change going on in police and fire service, I think personally it's strengthened community planning arrangements in the city because it's given a very specific focus to Edinburgh. So we see coming forward the police and fire plans were developed very much in partnership with the local authority and our local community planning arrangements, and a lot of citizen involvement in that. Over 3,000 people consulted on the police plan and hundreds consulted on the fire plan. In terms of the connectivity with the Edinburgh community plan, there's been no discernible negative impact there. There's good references to accidental fire deaths and police priorities, so that national priorities, local priorities described in the plan and the read across the local community plan are very strong as well. We are seriously looking at co-location in the city in terms of command teams and what will be described as the local authority liaison functions. John Dickey, particularly the fire commander, is keen at looking at that. And we have regular consultation engagement with our Chief Executive, Mark Williams, who's the Divisional Commander for Edinburgh Police, and John Dickey. So we see no discernible negative impact in partnership relations as a result of police and fire reform.
And before the other panelists come in, if I may, and with regard to these proposed developments, are you in consultation with the trade unions and the Fire Brigade Union and other staff associations about that?
That's something very much that colleagues in police and fire bring to the table. It's not something which a council would instigate, but certainly our modus operandi would be to check that, yes, certainly.
Anybody else wish to come in on that? No?
Okay.
Is that a supplementary or on my list? A supplementary. Colin, yes.
Yeah. Thanks very much and good morning. It's actually taking on a bit for what you were saying, Mr. Croft, in terms of the engagement has been very, very similar, I'm assuming, to how there was prior to the single service coming in. And I was just wondering, has the same engagement been taken right the way down into the local communities as before, whether through your neighbourhood partnerships and obviously community councils and stuff like that? Has there been any discernible change in your contact with people at local level?
I would say no. I think it's been strengthened. Certainly the development of the new fire plan, the one-year plan and the one-year police plan were done through neighbourhood partnerships. There were 6 events in the city and police, fire and council ran them jointly. There was a lot of citizen engagement in that. We are quite unique in Edinburgh in terms of our local community planning arrangements, and we have local tactical and coordinating meetings where we look at evidence to do with fire risks and crime and community safety risks. And that process had a bit of a hiccup, just pre-reform in terms of the analytical information we were receiving. But that has continued to progress now in quite a strong way, and citizen and community involvement in shaping local service priorities has remained a key feature through the reform agenda. So yes, I think there's a very strong link still with local communities and local engagement with local services.
Are there any particular demands on fire and rescue service in being a capital city or a major city like Glasgow or Aberdeen, you know, where major events take place? Are there particular demands on it, let's say?
other colleagues might want to answer, but certainly as a capital city, if I look at our events planning officer group, which is a mechanism to organise demonstrations, events, royal events, army events, we've got something going on in the city pretty much every day, and fire service are an integral part of that planning framework in terms of public safety and support. And there's close working relationships between the fire service and the police when joint agency command systems are set up for very big events and more contentious demonstrations. So yes, there is an extra demand on services certainly in Edinburgh because of that.
You wish to mention anything about that, Mr Duffy? I just thought major events in other cities that may be different requirements in the fire and rescue service, not necessary. Sandra, followed by Colin, and then John Lamont.
Thank you very much, Chair, and good morning, panel. I was interested to hear about the work that's going on, obviously, with community councils and police and obviously trade unions as well. And the figures that we've received have shown that fires are on the decline. The figures that we have received anyway, the number of fires are on the decline. And I just wanted to ask the panel, bearing in mind that it's not just about putting out fires that the SFRS are involved in, how they think the fire service should be changing to mark the trends of declining fire and how it affects everyone involved in the fire service, rescue service.
Mr Duffy, yes.
I think one of the key factors in the decline in fires is the work that has been done by the Fire and Rescue Service in prevention. And there's been there's almost a sea change, certainly in the last 10-15 years. The emphasis very much has moved on to the prevention agenda, and I think we're starting to see the results of a lot of work that has been done. What must be borne in mind is that most of that work is done by people who are the front line. They are the people who sit on the operational fire engines. So when they're not reacting to emergency situations, the primary role of the fire service now is prevention. So it's the protection of the crews, the retention of those crews. Not only does that maintain your ability to react to emergency incidents, it also retains your ability to push forward the prevention agenda. When the whole budget issue came forward at first, when we were faced with the significant reduction in the budgets across public sector, the fire service reaction to that was to move towards the single service in order to protect our ability to deliver the front line. And so I think what we have seen with the creation of the single service is the emphasis very much moving towards protecting those fire engines and the crews and maintaining their ability to go out and do the prevention work. What we are now looking at is, over and above that, the rescue capability of the service. Because we moved from being a fire brigade to being a fire and rescue service after the introduction of the 2005 Fire Scotland Act. What that didn't really specify was what it meant by rescue. I think it was one of the missed opportunities in the restructure in the reform process, was not to go deeper into what we tidying up the Fire Scotland Act and the Additional Functions Order, and we'd made that point during the consultation period. What we now need to do is to look at what we want the Fire and Rescue Service to deliver. The rescue capability is quite dramatically been enhanced over the last number of years. And one of the objectives of reform is more equitable access to that. And that is one of the key elements that we're now working on, is how do you give access across the whole of Scotland? And that's easy to say, but it's actually quite a difficult prospect, because you've got high density population, and then you've got extremely low density population. And how do you distribute your resources across the country? So that is sort of the next phase, if you like, of reform, is looking at how you distribute the rescue capability, how you widen the capabilities of the service to provide Scotland with a comprehensive fire and rescue service.
Yes, Ms Duncan.
Thank you.
Part of the prevention work, there's also quite a lot of work done to tackle antisocial behaviour in fire settings. So there's non-uniform staff involved in diversion programmes across Scotland, and we'd like to see that expanded as well. Part of working out what the fire service should do more of in the future involves investing in training for the fire service staff. And we need to look carefully at how that's provided and make sure that training isn't just for firefighters but for the support staff as well, because in order to provide efficient frontline services you need well-trained and well-skilled support staff to support them.
Yes, Mr Croft.
Yeah, sorry, I think you've hit on a really vital point about fire reform, which certainly we're keen to look at in Edinburgh. There are 15 dedicated staff in Edinburgh across 3 hubs looking at prevention stuff, and they do stuff like cool down crews, which is a youth diversionary activity, lots of stuff in schools. The discussion that's taken place through reform is a far more targeted approach to that, where chief social worker is sharing very sensitive information about very vulnerable clients that may be susceptible and vulnerable to accidental fire deaths. Now that's a new stage of preventative activity. So where these vulnerable clients are in houses that we own or ourselves own, could we put sprinklers in, fire retardant mattresses, stuff like that? So there's a new sort of discourse around prevention that's more targeted, which I think is very helpful and has been welcomed by the community planning partnership, certainly.
Just have a follow-up.
Yes, of course.
Thank you very much, Chair. I think it is a very vital point, and certainly I know that possibly everyone here goes out to their fire stations and brings people from that, staff as well, about the training. What I did want to ask you was, whilst you're all working very closely together, and that certainly comes across from your answers, in regards to, Ms Duncan has said, with the staff there, on the ground staff, is there lots of communication in regards to outreach work and training, as Ms Duncan has mentioned? And I know that Mr Duffy, obviously the firefighters, ones in the front line, will be there to go out and speak to schools and pensioners groups and whatever. But are the other members of staff involved in that too, along with the community partnerships? Or?
Yes, they are. Yes, and right. One of the intents of reform is that there's more involvement from non-uniform staff in doing that. And moving towards a single service means that people can spread their expertise across Scotland, and we would be encouraging our members to do that. But at the moment, to be honest, our members are concerned whether or not they have a job. The impact of the £19 million budget cut that the fire service has to absorb is being felt mostly by support staff. They're being matched into their jobs at the moment. Some of them are having to go through a competitive matching process. That's very uncertain for them. They're not sure what their pay grade is going to be in the future, because they're going to have to do a review of that. There's going to be a rationalisation of the properties that SFRS operates out of. We're involved in that process, but it's very, very difficult. People at the moment aren't sure what their job's going to be. They're not sure what they're going to get paid, and they're not sure where they're going to be working from. So while I think our members are doing a very admirable job making sure that the service continues, and nobody will really have noticed the creation of the single service on the 1st of April, which is to every employee's credit. I think there's got to be a recognition that that's been done, certainly from the support staff's perspective, in a period of really great uncertainty for them.
Thank you very much. I'm sure we'll raise that with the panel that's coming on after you. Thank you. Thank
Jenny,
Chair.
you were going to supplement.
Thank you, Convener. Yeah, 2 supplementaries to the issues that Sandra raised, but since we're on it now, the issue about your members and their terms and conditions and contractual issues, I wonder if there's any further issues that the trade union representatives wanted to raise on those matters with the committee.
My main concern is that the fire service just doesn't have the budget to deal with these issues properly. I think it's clear that there are potentially equal pay issues in the Scottish Fire and Rescue Service. We know from the experience in other parts of the Scottish public sector that's an awful lot more expensive to sort out than anybody ever thought at the beginning. I think that it's regrettable that the fire service didn't have a shadow year, to be quite honest. They're trying to carry on providing a service when everybody is in flux. at the moment. There was no shadow year where they could work out exactly what resources they needed where. They're having to redirect resources now to fill in gaps that they've realised are apparent and have to provide the service going on. And as I said, I think that they're doing an excellent job of that, and there's very good partnership working arrangements between the strategic leadership team and the SFRS and the trade unions. We are working and we're able to air the issues that our members are having, but it's very difficult for the fire service at the moment to tackle all those issues fast because there's just so much on their plate. I think reform didn't finish on the 1st of April this year. Everybody says that reform is actually going to carry on for several more years. So our members are looking at uncertainty and disruption until potentially 2016 or 2017, whilst everything works out. I don't think you'd like to be in that position very much, and a lot of our members are really finding it tough.
Say, Ms Duncan.
We only have security of tenure for about 4 years usually, but we start worrying well before that.
I'm well aware of that, yeah.
You say, Ms Duncan, that you have equal pay issues. Do you have members who you think have equal pay claims within the fire service?
I don't think we know that for sure at the moment, and we'd like to resolve that properly, not through the courts, but by doing a pay and grading exercise, choosing a job evaluation system and making sure that everybody gets onto a single pay system. Plans are in train for that at the moment. I think there's, in any organisation, there are potentially equal pay claims that we have to be mindful of, but I think we've all learnt the lessons from how that was handled in local government, for example, and we wouldn't want to go down that route, provided we have commitments to resolve that problem through negotiation and consultation in a reasonable timescale, and at the moment we have those commitments. But I accept that SFRS might be constrained by budgets, and I really regret that. I think there was an unrealistic budget applied to this organisation in expecting it to create a single organisation so fast.
I'd like to put the same question about terms and conditions and contractual issues to the FBU, if that's okay.
Yeah, I think in terms of contractual issues, the biggest threat for our members, and I think possibly the biggest threat to the Scottish Fire and Rescue Service, comes from the imposition of the 2015 Public Sector Pensions Act. It's the one issue that we can't really deal with here, and it is the one issue that is posing the greatest threat, and it's certainly the greatest concern for our members. In terms of the Scottish service and bringing together the standardisation of local terms and conditions, and there was quite a bit of variation across the 8 previous services, I'm quite convinced that work will be completed relatively quickly, and I'm encouraged by the collaborative approach that's been taken to address those. So, again, optimistic in terms of the standardisation of local terms and conditions, and deeply concerned about the pensions aspect.
Thank you. I also wanted to pick up on the point Sandra was raising regarding fire prevention. I've been lucky enough to accompany a fire team in Dundee on a fire prevention home visit, which was very good, and I was very impressed by. But I was slightly concerned with some issues that were raised with me about perhaps the strategic planning of these visits. I know the home fire safety visits are very important in preventing fire, but I wanted to ask the panel if you think there's work to be done on perhaps the logging of these visits, the strategic planning, work with the local plans that the police are putting together to, as Mr Croft raised, to maybe target vulnerable families and areas of high deprivation. Do you think there's work that could be done, or is there work already in train by the single service to be a bit more strategic about these visits, or do you think that's okay the way it's working at the moment?
I'm absolutely convinced if you ask the same question to the next panel, you'll get a different answer, because the Chief Officer and I have had this discussion many times about whether it's better to target or whether it's better to do blanket coverage. What we haven't been able to do, and it's partly the point that was raised in terms of budget, we haven't been able to really assess which system works better, targeting or a blanket approach. I think given the constraints that we're working under, it's probably a bit of both is going to be the approach that we take. And when you hear experience from the City of Edinburgh, that linking in with other agencies has got to be a key element as the service moves forward. We deal with a lot of the same people that the health boards deal with, that housing, either housing associations or councils deal with, social work deal with, police deal with. So it's about the sharing of information, and I think previously there was always a bit of keeping the cards close to your chest. That's our information. We're not going to share it. It's encouraging those barriers to be broken down. I think is absolutely vital. Community planning partnerships help and are working. I think what we've got to look at is where it's working best across Scotland and tease that out. The ability now with a single service to take good practice from one part of the country and deploy it elsewhere is one of the big benefits of having that single service, because there's no barrier to moving things across the country. But the interagency working is absolutely vital.
Can I just, I was sort of grubbing around here looking for the definition of rescue, and I'll just read this out as a point of information. The SFRS is a statutory duty under Part 2 of the 2005 Act as amended to respond to fires and road traffic accidents, and a power to respond to other events and situations. But similarly, the Fire Additional Function Scotland Order 2005 sets out other situations or events that the SFRS has a statutory duty to respond to, including chemical, biological, radiological, nuclear incidents, serious transport incidents, serious flooding, and search and rescue. It was just to clarify that although there wasn't a definition in the Act itself, in the primary legislation, secondary legislation actually has other statutory definitions within it for fire and rescue. Just thought I'd say it. But I don't know if you find it helpful or not, but it does broaden it out, and I hope it's helpful. Yes, Mr. Duffy.
I was trying to make earlier on was the Additional Functions Order defines a statutory obligation to rescue people from flooding. We know from parliamentary debate that flooding is defined as water on what would normally be dry land. What it doesn't give us is a statutory function to rescue people from water that would normally be water. And it's that clarification. We don't want to get into a situation where a sheriff, as part of a fatal accident inquiry, is defining what he determines to be rescue, and we've lived that experience, and it wasn't helpful.
I know. It says serious flooding here. It doesn't say where. It just says serious flooding. So I think that is a matter that need to be tested at some point. I take your point. It was just wasn't challenging you. It's just I was unaware there was another location for definitions, and I don't know if the committee were aware of it either. So just to add to the information. And that, I mean, you're mostly rescue nowadays, as you've indicated, from the change in culture, and well, we don't have coal fires in our houses and things like that anymore as much. So, although they're making a comeback, I believe.
What has been helpful is the Fire and Rescue Service framework.
Yes, this is what it's from. Yes.
That's helped clarify. The point I was making was we've left some of those anomalies in whilst we were going through a revision of the 2005 Act. We think it would have been useful to have done that at the same time, and it was a missed opportunity.
We'll leave that on the record because it's really, it was really just a point of clarification, but I accept your point.
Convener, sorry, can I just check if the other panellists have an answer to my question about prevention and targeting?
They didn't indicate that they wish to come in, so
yes,
you do, Mr. Croft, you do. You must let me know. Sorry. Right.
I think you've hit on a really essential tension in public service delivery at the moment, universality or more targeted stuff. I think in Edinburgh the approach is we're trying to do both, but maybe in a different way. So colleagues in Fire and Rescue Service are looking to train social workers, teachers, early years providers on general fire prevention safety advice, while then providing more specialist targeted stuff, so with vulnerable families or individuals or families with more chaotic lifestyles where they may be assessed to be fire risks. So that's the drift, I think, is that we continue to see a role for both, but who does that is slightly changing.
On that under the single service.
Yeah, As I said before, I do hold to the fact that certainly as a community planning manager in Edinburgh, I don't see any discernible negative impacts as a result of reform. If anything, it's focused more activity in an Edinburgh locus and strengthen partnership relations in Edinburgh, because you don't have that sort of force dynamic. I mean, I think it'd be fair to say that there is a tension between national priorities and local priorities, but I think fire and police have managed that very well.
John Lamont, Graham, then Colin, please.
Thank you, Convener, and good morning, panel. My question probably is more relevant to the next panel, but I'm going to put it to the three of you as well. It relates to the approval process of the local fire and rescue plans, and what may happen in the event that the local authorities don't approve the local plan. This was an issue that came up during the progress of the bill through the Parliament. And I know from the discussions I've had with my local fire chiefs that there's lots of consultation going on with the local authorities. It's very hard to imagine a scenario where the local fire and rescue plan won't be approved. But I suppose there is a scenario where maybe fire stations are being closed and the council decides to make a political stand and decides not to refuse. It decides to refuse approval on the basis it doesn't like the closure of these fire stations. And I just wondered if you've given any thought or consideration to the possibility that local fire and rescue plans may not be approved by the relevant local authority.
Mr Duffy.
From the Fire Brigades Union perspective, one of the things that we were keen to do in the whole scrutiny and engagement process was to encourage councillors, and as many councillors as possible, to engage in the process and to use a bit of a sales pitch, to use ourselves almost as that traditional counter to the management line. And you raised the point there about station closures. I mean, one of the goals of the whole reform process is to try and protect that frontline capability. So I would like to think that that isn't something that is going to be on the agenda. However, if you take that scenario, traditionally what has happened is that the fire service have put forward their facts and figures, and it's been countered usually by ourselves, and there's 2 or 3 fairly high profile cases where that process was gone through. What we would be looking to do is rather than it get to that confrontational point of view, if we're involved throughout the whole process, if a councillor is coming to the FPU and asking what the view, the professional view, they've got the service view, they've got the FPU view, if they're aligned, because it may not be as dramatic as a closure, but it may be the movement of equipment or resources from one station to another. And there's a good example of that took place in what was formerly Grampian, when appliances were moved from Dice Fire Station to Alton's Fire Station. The fact that the Fire Brigades Union and management both had the same line, that this is the best thing to do for the whole of the city, that almost reinforces that you've got it right. And I think what we're trying to do with the service and ourselves and you know the other rep bodies are involved in this process as well, is to try and take forward, here's what the service is trying to achieve, here's where we think collectively this is the best way of achieving that. And what you are looking to do then is to engage with local authorities and with councils to see that fits in with what they're also trying to achieve through their community planning partnerships. Now, if all of that's working, and I know it sounds great in theory, but if all of that's working right, you shouldn't have that conflict that was almost built into the old system. And what we've tried to do with the way that we're working now is to try and build that out of the system.
Yes, Ms Tonkins.
I think the collaboration, the partnership working, if you like, between all the representative bodies and the fire service and also local authorities. And Unison has a key role to play here because we have lots of members in local authorities as well who would be influencing or advising, rather, elected members there. I think you're more likely to get opposition to facilities closing, and it's not necessarily fire stations that would be proposed to close. It may be workshops or control rooms or headquarters functions for some of the old 8 services, you're much less likely to get opposition to that if the decisions are evidence-based and the whole process is explained thoroughly to the staff and to other stakeholders right from the beginning. And that's what we would be expecting to see, and we'll be encouraging the fire service to continue that approach as they go through this really difficult process of rationalisation.
Politicians don't get naughty and just decide to make it despite everyone's goodwill. I think there's another little aspect in there as well.
Forgive me for butting in there, but I think as representative bodies we have to be mindful that we have to be responsible in these situations, and it would be very easy for us, for a small group of members who were adversely affected, to participate in politically motivated campaigns to protect facilities. But I think we certainly are mindful that we have an obligation to the whole service and to the best interests of the majority of our members.
John, do you want to know? No. Graham, followed by Colin, please.
Thanks, Convener. Good morning. My question is largely about staff issues, whether it be support staff or firefighters. And many of the aspects of my original questions have been covered in earlier points.
My goodness, that makes a change, doesn't it? Usually you cover everybody else's.
That's so unkind of you. But a supplementary nevertheless. There were concerns on behalf of both firefighters and staff about the process of reform. We've now gone through that initial stage and we're into the experience of a single fire service. I wondered if you could share with us, other than the ones that you've already mentioned, are there any other remaining specific issues that you identify either currently or for the future which have impact for staff and relationships for the future?
Duncan?
I think in addition to the specific areas I mentioned earlier, I think there's going to be a refocusing of some of the work in specific corporate functions in the fire service. They already know that they've got 19 different payrolls at the moment. They want to go to one payroll system and remove that from local authorities. That's potentially a huge disruption and potentially impacts a lot of staff. I think there's more emphasis. They need better ICT, quite frankly, and more resources there. And they want to do more emphasis on learning and development and training. I think it's fair to say that training issues for support staff were largely ignored in the previous 8 services, and they appreciate that in order to create the culture of one service going forward, they need to train and develop their support staff as well. There's a lot on their plate, as I said at the moment. There's an awful lot of issues that need to be tackled right now, and you can't tackle everything at once. We're mindful of that. But we have to keep pushing the Scottish Fire and Rescue Service to deal with everything as quickly as they can, but do it properly.
Yes, Mr. Dodd.
Yeah, I think the main issue facing us is the new 3-year plan. So we have an interim plan for a year. So trying to capture all these issues that are being discussed today at committee into a coherent plan that has that elements of universality but also targeted for those most vulnerable citizens in Edinburgh. So that's certainly the big task. And discussions have already started about that, and helpfully discussions which are aligned to a similar discourse in the police about their 3-year plan. So council, police, fire service, and increasingly the third sector coming forward and saying what they have to offer. We have a lot of charities organisations in Edinburgh that employ around about 11,000 staff, so that's a very useful network for fire and police services to engage in partnership activity with. So I think there's certainly a stated intention to involve them more in the development of the fire plan going forward.
Mr. Duffy?
I think from our perspective, there's 2 or 3 points in there. And it's not about the detail of any of them. It's that broader aspect. If we are moving to a more rescue-oriented service, where do we locate that, and how do we move from what we've currently got and the structures that we've got at the moment to something that's different? I think in terms of all of these aspects where we are dealing with some difficult discussions to be had, we are encouraged by the way that those discussions are being undertaken, and I think one of the key things for us is about protecting that, because at the moment the approach that is being taken, which is it is radically different from the approach that we had previously, much more collaborative, much more collegiate, and I think that needs to be protected, and it is very much at this point in time reliant on personalities and individuals, and what we need to do is embed that further. So rather than discussing sort of maybe in details of what's missing, it's that overall we need to protect the approach that is being taken. And one aspect of that that was really highlighted to me at the last board meeting was you had the board members talking about how they can influence the agenda and the direction of travel, and you've got the senior management team clearly able to influence that agenda and the direction of travel, and the biggest single key group sitting in the public gallery. And if there was a single missed opportunity in this whole thing, it's excluding the voice of the representative bodies and the trade unions from either the board or the board process. And we need to look at that. What effectively you had the various groups for the best of intentions want to drive the service forward and move it in a positive direction, and what you had was us sitting in the public gallery hearing we'll do this and we'll do that, and we're being left behind. If we're doing this for the technical bits, we need to do it for the overall, the strategy and the vision.
Yes.
Just to follow that up, I mean, I think in the last time I came and gave evidence to this committee, we said that Unison's preference for the composition of the board was to have an employee director and to follow the NHS model. And I think I agree absolutely with what John's saying. I think there was a missed opportunity in the bill to follow up that very good precedent in the Scottish public sector with having employee representatives on NHS boards. And I think that's something that should be looked at for the future of the Scottish Fire and Rescue Service.
Why we didn't do it? Can anybody remember why?
I think we had an amendment on it, did we not? Yeah, it
I
was
can't
rejected.
remember. But anyway, it sounds a very sound proposal now, but we'll see how things. Graham, have you anything else to ask?
Yes, please. First of all, thanks very much for those comments. I think that the session thus far must have been a good consultancy issue for the next panel coming on side. They were glowing through the first part of the presentation, but it dimmed slightly towards the end. On the subject of ICT, and it's probably one largely for Sarah, but perhaps Mr Duffy would want to contribute. We've spoken earlier about the joining up of a national system in the police context, and obviously you've referred to the need to join up your 19 finance systems, for instance, and I'm sure there are others. Is there an opportunity to join the two systems together and gain even more savings in terms of the efficiencies that can be delivered, or is the challenge just too much to bear?
We should learn the lessons from other big public sector ICT projects where there's been great plans on paper and then it's been almost impossible to make it work in practice. The NHS is, again, a very good example of that. Certainly from a Unison perspective, I'm always very grateful that I was given the fire service to deal with and not the police service. And I'm not sure that it would be very sensible for the Scottish Fire and Rescue Service to try and do too many joint projects with the police function at the moment, because I certainly think that the fire service is operating much more smoothly at the moment. So no, I think we've tried for the last 10, 12 years to have big cross-sector, public sector ICT projects, and none of them have come off. And there's good reasons for that. I don't think we should waste any more money on it, to be honest.
Sat through the presentation on the police ICT project, the name of which escapes me, but that's the one.
Sat through it too.
The one question is the deliverability of that. What they've done is designed a solution for the police. I don't think that is transferable, although clearly the technology would be, but you would need to design a solution that suited the fire and rescue service, and that comes down quite simply to cost. And I would rather we didn't spend it on a project that might not see the light of day, and instead spend the money more practically.
I think it's useful because we did raise it at the subcommittee on policing, and it was such a trail there. Colin.
Now I've scored off half a dozen questions that he's brought up again. I'm down to my last one now. I hope you understand. Yeah. So, having heard what you've said and taken that on board, I'm thinking in terms of nationally, we've heard obviously from Mr. Croft that things are generally doing okay here in the capital, but nationally, are there any challenges in any particular area? Because obviously Edinburgh is so different from Grampian and the islands, whatever. Are there any challenges in terms of operational matters which you are finding more difficult to overcome since the changeover to the single service? Any particular area?
I think generally the answer is no. I think things are progressing the way we had anticipated they would progress. I think before the decision was made to go to a single service, we heard people from predominantly the central belt had anticipated that the money would be drawn out of the central belt and put out to Highlands and Islands and the borders and the outlying areas. And when you spoke to people from the Highlands and Islands...
I'm going to say we're ahead of you. Quite the opposite in the borders, thought it would all go to the central belt. Absolutely. Well, that spoke for you.
When you speak to the outlying areas, they felt it was all going to be drawn to the middle. And I think, we were aware that operationally, neither of those things can actually happen because the service isn't built around the geography, it's built around the risk, and it follows the risk. Now, it happens that most of the risk are people, so most of the resources are where most of the people are, and that was never going to change. One of the things that we do need to look at is how do we distribute, particularly the specialist skills that we've got, and the more technical rescue capabilities. And that's the challenge at the moment. But in general terms, I think we're quite content that we will see the local fire station being the local fire station and providing the local service across the country. We need to look at how that's delivered. In large parts of Scotland, we are experiencing difficulties caused by the particular commuting, let's say. If you go back 20 years ago, a lot of our towns and villages surrounding the cities were self-sustaining. More and more what we're seeing is that they are becoming commuter belts, and people are being drawn into the cities for work. What that does for us is it reduces the number of people that we've got available during the day, and particularly around the cities. And I'm thinking Dundee, for example, where you look at Kirriemuir, Forfar, Brechin, they get drawn in. The same will happen in Edinburgh, the same happens in Glasgow. That's causing difficulties in getting crews for the appliances in those outlying areas. That's something that we need to address, and that is going to be one of the big challenges facing the service in the coming years. The problem is nothing actually to do with the single service. This was happening anyway. What we've now got is less of a budget, but more of a focus and more of an ability, because you've got that single service, to come up with a solution that can work across the whole of Scotland. So rather than perhaps previously you might have gotten a solution in one part of the country and still had that problem somewhere else because they couldn't afford to deliver that solution, what we have now is a potential to create a solution across Scotland, but that will take a lot of time, effort, and a lot of hard work, because that's a difficult challenge.
Duncan.
In terms of support staff, the principle is decentralisation, and we're in partnership, we're exploring flexible working options. So people who work in the finance department don't all necessarily need to be based in Hamilton. They can work for the finance department and stay in their home in Inverness at the moment. And I think the service is being good in encouraging that. And I think that it's fair to say that my members across Scotland, they all feel equally uncertain. They're not more uncertain in Glasgow or more uncertain in Inverness or Dundee. They're all equally uncertain about the future. But I believe that the intent is there from the management team to ensure that there are possibilities for fire and rescue support staff to be based across Scotland, and we will be holding them to that.
And John, very brief supplementary emphasis on brief.
It's to Mr Duffy, and it's just very specific. Since you mentioned geography, there were particular issues about deficiencies in training in the Highlands and Islands. Are you able to provide any reassurance on that, Mr Duffy? I know it's not, because these people are your members.
I think if you were wanting the single best example of why the Scottish Fire and Rescue Service should have been brought in, it was Highlands and Islands. They were in dire straits in terms of their ability to train their staff. What was done, and there was a lot of effort put into that, was they got access to resources from the rest of Scotland. Now, where previously there were borders involved with that, and there were difficulties involved in overcoming those borders, that's gone. And what they've got is access to all of the resources from the whole of Scotland. And if that one area highlights the advantage of having that single service, it's the training facilities and the training capabilities of services like the former Highlands and Islands area.
Thank you.
A note for the Highlands and Islands, and indeed what appears to be a relatively optimistic vision for the single fire service and rescue service. Thank you very much for your evidence. And I'm now going to suspend for 5 minutes. Session. I welcome our second panel of witnesses who I note sat through that other evidence session. I think they were glowing at one point and then the glow was dimming, but we'll soon find out. That was your comments, I think, Graham. I welcome Pat Waters, Chair of the Board of the SFRS, Alistair Hay, Chief Officer of the FSRS, and Assistant Chief Officer Dave Boyle, Director of Service Delivery West. Welcome, gentlemen, and questions, please. John?
Thank you, Convener, and good morning, panel. You've heard my question already. It relates to the local fire and rescue plans and the need for the local authorities to approve these plans. And this was a concern we had during the passage of the bill through Parliament, particularly the eventuality or the possible eventuality that the councils may refuse to give their approval. And I fully appreciate there's lots of work going on to ensure that doesn't happen, but there is at least the possibility that in politically charged circumstances, like for example what we've had over court closures recently, where a local authority may decide not to approve the plan. And whilst I recognise that there is work going on to address that possibility or to prevent that happening, what would happen if a local authority did refuse to approve the plan?
Yes, Mr. Waters.
Can I maybe start and then I'll hand it over to my professional colleagues? Can I say the legislation is quite clear that we have to get agreement to that local plan. There is no other option but to get agreement. There is no appeals mechanism, there is no fallback position, and so therefore what the legislation does is encourage us to actually sit down and discuss it to get to a resolution so that we can move forward. You know, I don't have any, I mean, I'm probably one of these fortunate people, my glass is always half full. And I always believe that if you discuss something, you can get to a resolution and move forward. So therefore, I believe that the legislation does not tie the hands of the service or the hands of the authority, but what it does is make us sit down and work through till we get to a conclusion, we can get agreement and we can move forward. But I'll hand over to the Chief.
Sorry, I mean, with the greatest respect, the legislation is not clear. I mean, it doesn't deal with the eventuality of agreement not being reached. I think it's important just for the record to record that legislation does, I accept, encourage parties to reach an agreement, but it does not actually specify what happens if the local authority does not approve the plan.
That's absolutely right, and that's the point I'm making, that encourages both to make sure that what we do is reach agreement.
Mr. Hay.
Yep. This is something that has exercised everybody's thinking since the concept was actually first floated when the legislation was being drafted. And I was involved in some of those early discussions. And there is always a keenness for people to jump straight to the end game. It's to ask the question, well, what will happen if you don't agree? And as the legislation was being drafted and I saw the practicalities that would support the delivery, the intent of that legislation was being discussed. I think what came out is that desire for a cultural shift within the fire and rescue service. So as opposed to having a piece of legislation that enabled you to jump straight to, well, you've failed, and not to have that discussion and not to work actually in serious partnership to deliver the intention, which is to improve outcomes for citizens wherever they are in Scotland. I think the legislation was designed to encourage us to work in that very open and partnership approach. That was the intent, and that's the way that we've been setting up the service, and that's what we've been trying to do. We all know that in partnerships, you know, wherever they're taking place, there are difficult times. Everything doesn't always go smoothly, and ultimately, you know, you may have a falling out over things. But what you want is that return to, you know, a normal relationship as quickly as you possibly can. So that's the whole thrust of the way that we've been trying to set up the planning to deliver local plans that are appropriate within individual local authorities across the country. It's to avoid getting to the point where you actually fall out. That being said, if you ever did get to that point where you did fall out, then it has to be resolved, because what we cannot do is allow the vital public services that we deliver, emergency response and prevention and protection, not to be available. Because we haven't agreed on something. We would need to continue delivering those services whilst that resolution, that discussion continued in whatever forum. And the way that we have set up the service is we have local senior officers. These are statutory appointments. It's their responsibility to work with the local authority to get that agreement. But in terms of the board, we've got 3 service delivery areas across Scotland, and we have allocated 4 board members to each of these 3 service delivery areas, and part of their role is to work with the local authorities and other local partners to make sure that the work of the LSOs is effective, that partnership working is forming in the way that it's intended to improve outcomes for local communities. So that's part of their role. And although we haven't formally set up a disputes resolution process for the reasons that I articulated earlier, because I think that was done very deliberately, I could envisage in the future that there would be a role for both the professional management of the service and for the board to sit down with the local authorities and really drive through why we have failed to agree. But because the board members have already begun to develop those relationships within those local authority areas, then the possibility of resolving it successfully to improve outcomes, I think, is already greatly enhanced.
Yes, Mr Vaughan.
Thanks, Chair. Just to go into a wee bit more specifics, I'm responsible for 13 councils in the West, and I've met with every council leader and chief executive, and this has never once been asked at all about the failure to agree a local plan. Everyone is absolutely excited that this is their local issues for their local communities, and we are there in partnership to deliver against them. In terms of specific to the question you asked earlier on to John and Sarah, just about a station closure, for example, John gave an excellent answer in terms of partnership working. If the unions, the trade unions and representative bodies are involved at the start of these discussions, that's something we'll take together collectively and view across the whole service. The other thing that's assisting the journey at this moment in time is Pat has divided the board, the 12 members, into 4 representatives in each of the 3 areas. So I've got 4 board members that assist me in the West with that. One of the benefits of reform is creating a greater connection with local authorities. So we actively go in and meet with the community planning partners, with the chief executives and the officials, the staff in the area, to find out what their concern is, to hear their local thinking, to link the local issues into the national thinking that we're taking forward. So I think we've covered virtually every eventuality to make sure that this works.
Sorry,
sorry, Mr Hay.
Sorry, could I just add a little bit more? Clearly what we also have is the ministerial priorities set out within the framework, and from that we will draw down a strategic plan, and from the strategic plan we will develop the local plans. So in terms of what we are trying to achieve as a fire and rescue service, there's a very clear line of sight for any local authority, so nothing should come as a surprise. So I think the culture we're trying to create, the mechanisms and the structures that surround that, but also that clear line of sight, are all intended to prevent that conflict, which I think could be a possibility, and it will be resolved if it occurs. But it's avoiding that and working together to improve outcomes has to be everybody's focus, and it's what we all have in common.
Yeah, I mean, I also look at life from a half-glass full perspective as well. But
used to the committee, John, but there we are.
But I also think that legislation should deal with the worst-case scenario and set out what should happen in the event of, disagreement happening. And clearly, from what Mr Waters has already acknowledged, there is a gap in the legislation in terms of how to deal with that. And I fully accept what your intent is and what the direction of travel should be, and that is correct. But questions, I mean, I've met my local fire chiefs, and they're very, very clear. There is a gap, and they're not sure what would happen if there was a disagreement between the local authority and or they refused to approve the fire plan. Would they, for example, have to revert back to following the previously agreed fire plan, or would they have discretion to put together their own sort of short-term provisions pending agreement? It isn't clear on the face of the Act what should happen. So I fully accept what you're saying, and you're to be commended for your direction of travel on this, but there is a gap here which I hope will never come to need to be addressed, but there is at least an acknowledgement that there is an issue potentially for the future.
You were all nodding, so I take it you agree that in the last resort there is a gap. Right, thank you. Colin, you want a supplementary to that?
Yeah, it was just with Mr Waters' vast experience of COSLA matters. If this issue had ever come across that particular forum, if it had been discussed there, and if there was any views coming from COSLA in relation to Mr Lamont's question.
Can I say I would never be as presumptions? I mean, there's nothing more X than an X. And I am the ex-president of COSLA. David O'Neill is the present president of COSLA. And it'd be a matter,
vast experience of...
You know, I mean, no, it was not a matter that was discussed during my term as president of COSLA. But I'm sure, like say, and like everything else, we dealt with many tricky issues during the time when I was president of COSLA, and some issues that not everybody agreed on. At the end of the day, we always found a formula to take things forward that benefited local government at that particular point. And I certainly would have no less intent during this process that we would take forward something that benefited the communities that we're all there to serve.
Thank you.
Rod, was that you wanting a supplementary? No.
Supplementary.
So you've got a question down. Graham, followed by Sandra, please.
Thank you, Convener, and good morning, panel. My question is hopefully seeking your advice on the experience of the last 6 months with a view to how we take things forward for the future. The Act created two separate services, police service on one side, fire and rescue on the other, an authority on one side, a board on your own side of things. And I don't think it's any secret that there has been difficulties in terms of governance and oversight the police side. Much of that around governance and oversight, IT, finance, corporate services, the very same issues that you will have dealt with over the last 6 months and for the future. Would the panel offer any advice on how you managed to deliver things, apparently with little upset, and certainly having listened to the earlier panel with a great deal of commitment and universal support? What was the secret of delivering thus far and to the future, and what advice would you give us?
Mr. Waters.
Yeah, can I say, Graham, I'd love to take the credit for all this. I really would love to take the credit for all this. But the foundations were set long before either myself or the chief was appointed, and that was a partnership that was developed between the people looking at how they take the service forward in a single service. So the foundations were set for us, that partnership working, that respect for each other, that taking, you know, on board and having regular meetings and discussions and taking and listening to what our staff was saying, their staff representatives were saying, and the partnership between the services at the time, the government and the staff that formed the foundation for how we take things forward. I think we have carried on that, and I think the likes of the I think it was said earlier on in evidence, there's probably a rare example of how you can successfully work together to deliver something that you jointly agree is necessary to make sure what we've got is a service that we can all be proud of into the future. It's about protecting the service that we deliver. At the present time, we're focused on changing how we manage the service. We're still providing a local service at local level from local stations, and that will not change. You know, that's what we intend to do. But I think the foundations were there right from the start. We have picked up that and continued, and I think it's an example of how we take things forward. If we ever get to a stage where the service feels that we're doing something to them and not doing it in conjunction with them, then I think we will hit the problems that other areas have hit. I fully intend that we don't get to that position, that we work in partnership to deliver.
But before we go on, just to finish that point, so the Act enabled everything that you required of the service and your needs as an authority, as a board, and the essence of, I think, what you've told us there is it's about culture, about relationships, and it's about communication.
Didn't provide us with enough money, of course, but I mean, that's another thing. That's another thing.
No, that's your swan song, Pat.
But could I say, yeah, I mean, I do believe that the foundations were set, the legislation was there, and what we've done is picked up on that and continued it forward. I mean, so far, and I heard what was said in evidence, but we have got the trade unions as fully integrated as part of the board as well. They're on fully members of 2 of my subcommittees, you know, and delivering, including the transfer, the transformation committee and how we move the service forward.
Thank you.
Yes, Mr. Boyle.
I could probably just go back to 2010. Pat made reference there to the foundation that the board came into. Back in 2010, when we first started looking at an element of reform across wider public service, but particularly police and fire. I got involved, actually, and Alistair was involved in that first meeting too with Scottish Government to start looking at options. There was an early, I suppose, difference of opinion, but the difference of opinion was one of governance. We thought it was a local authority controlled fire service. We were looking at national service and options in between. A couple of public consultations later, everyone was signed up, it was national service. The one thing that was absolutely clear, but we were all trying to deliver the same thing for our local communities, regardless of the governance model that sat above it, and that united everyone. So I was embedded within the service team within government to take that forward. And the Gateway Review, as part made reference to there, picked up back in May 2012 that the partnership work between government, service management and the trade unions was truly groundbreaking. Now that's the foundation that put us together, people sharing a common direction of travel. There's been differences of opinion along the way. We've looked at various models around the world for governance and all the rest of it. We took good advice. But ultimately, it was people and relationships that made the difference in the end of the day. We worked endlessly with COSLA, seeking their views with local authorities. We got out, we did whole heaps of network arrangements, and you've probably been to some of the network events that were hosted down at Verity House. Hugely successful. We're still doing learning events. We're still actually trying to unpick what we did to actually make sure we could learn for the future, and others that may follow may learn from the future. We are getting eyes cast across from all parts of the world about the success story it has been. But relationships built the way for that. So it was built on a common sense of purpose and sense of direction, and actually sharing that journey. And if you're going to walk down a path for 95%, or if you're going to have 95% of the journey common, let's have the fallout at the end over the 5%. Let's not fall at the start and not get the starting blocks. So that built the foundations that Pat has spoken about there.
Words are echoing in some other places. Mr. Hay.
I mean, I would really just add my voice to my two colleagues. The partnership working in this has been key from the outset. If it hadn't been for partnership working, I think it would have been a much more difficult challenge than it actually is. A part of your question there was in relation to the separation between the support functions and the actual service delivery area. You know, I can't comment specifically on police because I don't know any of the detail on that. But what I can say from my own experience, and I think Sarah Duncan, you know, alluded to this in a number of her answers, is that we have been a very successful organisation. And we've reduced the number of primary fires in Scotland by about 40% over the last decade. And quite rightly, the staff that work in the front line get much of the credit for that. But I'm very clear that support staff are actually enabling staff. The fact that they service the vehicles, the fact that they do the strategic planning, the fact that they pay people enables that frontline service delivery to actually happen. So what we're trying to create here as an organisation where everybody understands that they are actually enabling that front line to happen. They're actually making sure that those improvements are going to happen, and they can clearly see where they are contributing to it. And I think it's a strength of the Scottish Fire and Rescue Service that we are all part of that one organisation and we are not separated.
One last question. Can you remind us who the accountable officer is for the business of fire and rescue?
He's actually sitting beside between me and Mr Boyle.
It's the Chief Officer?
Yes.
Thank you.
That's an Exocet question. If anybody remembers the Exocet missiles. What? Sandra, followed by Colin.
Thank you, Chair, and good morning, gentlemen. I think one theme that's came out from the previous panel and the panel that's here is that you do have good partnership working, but there are some issues, and I think it was raised by union representative in regard, and I think I've got the word for correct, as you mentioned, real difficulties of reorganisation, uncertainty of staff and training of support staff. I just wonder if you could pick up in that. And one other issue I wanted to mention also was the fact that you now have a 3-year plan, which I would think that would be much better than just a 1-year plan. And how does that fit into some of the issues that was raised by Ms Duncan?
In an organisation like ours, it is people that make it work. So we're very focused on the people issues. We've looked at best practice. Audit Scotland very helpfully produced a best practice guide in terms of public service mergers, indicating where they have gone well and indicating where issues have arisen in the past. And we've been using that very much to actually guide the whole process going forward. Staff do feel uncertain. I have to say that the firefighters less so, because the number one aim of reform is to protect the front line and improve frontline outcomes. They still feel uncertain, but not quite as much as those that are working in our enabling services. So what we are looking to do is to give them as much certainty as we possibly can in a time of uncertainty. So we produce very early what our working structures are. We produce those working structures in consultation with all the trade unions and the other representative bodies. We shared them with the staff. So what they then do is they have a look at it and they go, well, I can perhaps see where I have a future in the new Scottish Fire and Rescue Service. Of course, the second question that arises is, well, I can see there's a job that I might be able to do, but where is that likely to be? Because I've lived my whole life in Aberdeen and I'm not particularly keen on my job being transferred to Dundee or anywhere else within the country. So there is an element of flexible working that we will try to build into that. But what we're working on at this moment is what we're terming our strategic intent document in terms of our main buildings, things like headquarters, and we want to share that again with staff as early as we possibly can. It'll take us a number of years to achieve that. So that way they know where we're going, and hopefully what they will also very quickly be able to establish is a timeline that we intend to follow to get to where we need to be as an organisation. And there'll be occasions where they're quite happy because it suits them as individuals, but there'll also be occasions where they feel unhappy because it doesn't suit them as individuals. But the fact that they know helps them, to come to terms with that. And then what we need to do then is we need to give them genuine options. We need to be able to treat them as individuals. So it's bringing it down to that actual level. And one of the things we did very early on to show that we are genuine in what we're saying, we're not just saying that there will be options, is we are recruiting firefighters this year because we want to protect the front line, and we initially offered 40 firefighter posts through a competitive process, but for support staff who wish to transfer over. So when you say there will be retraining and redeployment opportunities within that flexible package, well, here was a very tangible example of it, and I was encouraged because we had 72 members of support staff actually were interested in those 40 jobs, and we're at the end point now where we've almost recruited those 40 support staff. And what that does then, of course, is it creates gaps around the organisation, and if you've got gaps around the organisation, you can start moving things about, you can start giving people other opportunities. So I think a key in all this is the genuineness of our approach, and exempling it by things like offering those firefighter posts as help to calm staff down at a time when understandably they are feeling slightly concerned about what the future might hold for them as individuals.
Anything else, Sandra? Anybody else wish to comment? Don't have to. Sandra, anything else you wish to ask?
No, thank you. That was an excellent answer for the questions
Roderick,
I asked. Yeah,
thank you, Roderick, followed by Jenny. You're after that. Colin's, I've slipped Colin down because he's had a supplementary.
Right, okay. Morning, gentlemen. I'd just like to kind of probe you a bit more in terms of your view going forward on budgetary challenge.
Excuse me a minute. Settle down now. Settle down. Don't look upset. Right, Roderick.
Right, we'll start again. I'd just like to probe you about your view on the budgetary challenges going forward, particularly changes from resource to capital next year, and how you see budgetary pressures panning out over the next period of time.
If I could maybe speak from the board, and then I'll hand you over to Alistair or Dave, who will probably get more detail for you. I mean, certainly we've had a look at this year. We are very confident that looking at this year we are you know, we will keep in line with our budget. Next year will be more difficult, but we are still confident that given the how we try and move the organisation forward, we will still be able to meet our budget. There is some opportunities for us to rationalise in buildings that we need to take, but that will not happen immediately. For every consequence, for every decision we take, there's consequences for other parts of the organisation. We need to be aware of all those before we take them, and that's how I think, as was said earlier on, the 1st of April was only the start of the process. It was not the end of the process. It will take us some time to get to where we want to be in the single service. You know, so we are confident, and in speaking to the senior management, the board are confident that we can meet our budgetary pressures that are coming up. You know, will it be easy? No, it won't be easy. There'll be difficult decisions to be made to get there, but we are still confident that we can actually do that. But I'll hand over to Alistair or Dave, who can maybe fill you in more detail.
There's no doubt that the budgetary challenges for us are significant, and I would not seek in any way to underplay the challenges that meeting our budget constraints will bring to us. However, as Pat has just said, we are planning to meet these. If you look at it, there's probably 4 areas that we focus on. One is a reduction in staff numbers and the associated costs. That would be a key element. 80% of our budget actually goes on paying staff. The second thing is looking at our assets, our property assets, and looking to rationalise those, but also rationalise contracts. There was mentioned earlier the fact that we're running 19 different payroll systems. Personally, I find that quite difficult to understand because we were 8 services. So how do we have 19 payroll systems? But apparently we did.
Paid that don't exist or something, you know.
Well, as the accountable officer, I sincerely hope not. So we need to rationalise assets, we need to rationalise contracts. So you can imagine, you know, the myriad of ICT contracts, you know, payroll contracts, legal services contracts, all that we have to have. So we're looking at doing that. We've already heard mention of things like shared services, perhaps with you know, our blue light colleagues in police and ambulance, but there are many other opportunities there. And another key thing is streamlining process, so looking at all the processes that are actually happening and recognising that each stage of every process may involve a cost. And is it necessary? So we're very focused on those 4 key areas to drive cost out of the organisation. In the first year, in real terms, we've reduced our budget by £19.5 million. The cashable saving was considerably less than that, but one of the things we've had to do as a national organisation and moving out with the local government finance settlement regime is we now have to pay VAT on goods and services. So that's been a significant challenge for us that we've had to pick up in year 1, but we've taken £19.5 million in real terms out. Next year, we've got cashable savings of £12 million. To make, and the year after it's £7.5 million that we have to make. So those are significant, especially when you add on the inflationary pressures. One of the things that does slightly concern me is the phasing of that the fact that we've got £12 million next year and a smaller the year after, because some of these issues that I've mentioned, like asset rationalisation, disposing of properties, you can't just do that. You know, there's a whole process that has to go through. So we have challenges like that. But what we certainly are doing is you know, focusing on those areas and planning to meet those financial challenges as we go forward.
Have you actually got a schedule of kind of potential disposable properties? Any idea as to kind of how that might?
We've already started the work on that. We've used the professional staff that work within the Scottish Fire and Rescue Service to bring that together. We've also been working with the Scottish Futures Trust and Hubco to have a look at that, because what we want to look at is pan-public sector property, not just what we have, because clearly police and other public agencies are going through similar processes at this moment in time. And we've also been working with the private sector, initially with a company called Rydens. So we're starting to do that. What our intention would be is that in the end of this month, in the June board, we will be bringing a paper forward where, in conjunction with the board, we would agree what the criteria are and what the appraisal process would be in terms of disposing of any property assets. and then looking towards late summer, early autumn, in August and September, what we'd be looking at then is the individual business cases for specific types of properties, for example, workshops. And then in September, we'd be looking at overlaying the business cases for the needs of specific types of properties against the criteria and the appraisal process. And we always have to reference this back to the Scottish Public Finance Manual, because that's, you know, the governance regime under which we actually operate, and it has clear guidance on how you would appraise properties in terms of acquisition and disposal of those things. So that's a brief outline of the process and where we are with that at this moment in time.
I've got Jenny, to be followed by Colin if no one else wants to intervene and ask a question to depose him yet again. Jenny.
Thanks, Convener. Mr Waters, would an employee representative be useful on the board?
There is the opportunity for myself and the Minister to discuss the addition to the board. I think it's too early for me to say what gaps we have in our board in terms of expertise and experience. But I have agreed with the Minister that we'll sit down after a period of operation and look at where the gaps are. And the Minister is quite clear that if there's gaps, she intends to make sure that we can actually fill those gaps. To bring a member of staff onto the board, we have to have a change in legislation.
You said after a period. What period is that?
I think after about 9 months in operation, we will sit down and look at if there are any gaps in the board. We're only, no, 9 months from the start. We're only 11 weeks into operation. But as I said, you know, like say earlier on, I mean, we have trade union representatives as full members of our subcommittees, in particular our transformation committee, but looks about how we take that forward. And we have 2 members of our trade union representatives as full members of that committee, and also they're on the other liaison committee we have with all the trade unions. So there is an active participation in board work, but I think we need to sit down and look about what the impact would be to make it a bigger board than it is at the present time. But I'm happy to do that, and the Minister's quite confident that we'll do that after 9 months of operation.
Okay. It'll be interesting to see the progress on that, because it was an amendment to the bill in the first place that did receive a lot of support, but not government support. I wanted to go back to my question on fire prevention that I put to the first panel. I suppose particularly directed at Mr Hay. I mean, you heard that I'd been on a home fire safety visit in Dundee, which I thought was very, very useful, but did pick up that perhaps maybe support staff and their abilities to interrogate data and use their skills for strategic planning and perhaps targeting, and certainly when it comes to logging and follow-up actions on all of these things, that perhaps there should be a more comprehensive system put in place. I don't know if the Chief Officer can update and perhaps explain about his ambition in this area.
I mentioned earlier about streamlining process and making sure that when the firefighters have been out doing home fire safety visits, or it's not just firefighters that do home fire safety visits, we've also got members of what you could loosely term support staff who have an expertise perhaps in accessing and engaging and working with hard to reach communities that do this type of activity as well. But if we can make sure that they focus on doing the work and then not getting caught up in the bureaucracy of recording it, but it needs to be recorded so we know we've done it, but also so we can evidence whether it's having an impact and improving outcomes. So I think we need to have a very strong focus on that part of it quite early on, because there's different approaches right across Scotland, and I think what we need to do is have a very clear line of sight between the money that we have in the organisation, the activities that we're engaging in, and the outcomes that we're actually achieving, so that we can see that that public money is being spent to best effect because of the activities that we engage in. Specifically in relation to home fire safety visits, there's been much debate around this, whether you have a targeted approach or whether you have a universal approach. And the answer is you need a mix of both. My personal view, and I was a senior officer in Tayside for many years, and we went for a very universal approach. And if you look at Audit Scotland, you see that the number of home fire safety visits done in the old Tayside area, was in some cases, 10 or 20 times greater than that done in other services. And I was a big advocate of that. And my rationale behind that was based on two pieces of evidence. At the turn of the century, in England and Wales, there was a home fire safety grant given to fire authorities across the country, and they had a very clear target for the reduction in the number of fire deaths that they had to achieve. They were given £10 million, which sounds a lot of money, but spread across England, you can understand, is not a huge amount of money. And they then engaged a company to evaluate whether or not that money had actually delivered value and whether it helped them to meet that reduction in fire deaths target. And what came back from that was that by simply fitting smoke detectors in every home in England, you would easily meet the target that was set. In fact, you would probably be able to double the target. So that was very strong evidence. They then took that £10 million and they said, well, what about the economic cost of fire? How much does fire actually cost society when you put it all in? And the evidence that came back from that was the return was between 14 and 30 times. So in terms of value, you were getting 140 to £300 million for a £10 million investment. And that was not a targeted approach, that was a universal approach. Cheshire Fire and Rescue Service then commissioned Liverpool University to do a piece of work. And they said, what Cheshire did is they had the ambition to do a home fire safety visit for every single house within Cheshire. So they embarked upon that route, and they then got Liverpool University to compare with family group fire and rescue services, similar demographics, similar profiles, and asked the question was, well, those that are not doing it universally, those that are targeting it, is there statistically, and that's a hard word for me to say, can you prove it using stats that the universal approach is better than the targeted approach? And actually what came out was that the universal approach was better. So the question you have to ask yourself is why? Because on the face of it, targeting the most vulnerable would be the right thing to do. But of course, what you have to understand is that we all know vulnerable people, don't we? Nobody thinks they're vulnerable. I've got, my father's 86 now. He thinks he's as robust as he was when he was 25, but he isn't. That's just the reality of things. So I can give advice to my parents. We've all got kids that, perhaps will leave home and will move into flats or perhaps rented accommodation. So actually what you do through the universal approach is you don't just have the 9,000 staff that work for the Fire and Rescue Service as advocates for community safety, but informed advocates. Everybody that you've met, everybody that you've engaged with can actually start delivering those messages and start changing the approach that people take to their own safety across Scotland. So I think that's the reason why it actually works, that universal approach. However, there's no doubt about it that targeting the most vulnerable people, and we heard examples in Edinburgh earlier about that work and senior social workers sharing very confidential information so that we can go and target the most vulnerable, because perhaps for some people education programmes alone are not enough, and there's also engineered mechanical solutions that can be put in place to help them, simple things like fire retardant blankets. So that partnership working and targeting the most vulnerable, I think, complements that universal approach as we go forward. I know this is a long answer, but
Sorry.
But the last part of that as well is that for a firefighter, you could be the best trained, best equipped firefighter in the world, but you actually need to know where you're going. So getting out and about in your streets and knowing your communities, knowing your streets. We've got an issue in Scotland that distresses me quite considerably, and that's when I hear about attacks on firefighters. But I'll tell you what, it's difficult to attack people that you actually know and who know you. So being out and about in your communities and being very visible within your communities, that's a side benefit of doing that universal approach. So you get to know your station area, you get to know your communities, your people. While you're out there doing the home fire safety visit, 2 people in the house, The other firefighters, what they're doing is they're checking out, you know, access around the back of the properties. What they're actually doing is they're looking where the hydrants are and other water supplies, so they're learning their station area. They're out there on that station ground, getting to know it extremely well. And if you've been into a property, there might be 200 or 300 other properties, exactly the same layout. You might not get a fire in that property, but if you get a fire in another property, it's got the same layout. If you already know it, in terms of firefighter safety, that's a big issue for me as well. So I think there's lots of unseen benefits that perhaps people don't, you know, focus on that are there. And the last bit I'd add to that is in terms of that wider partnership. You know, there's maybe 800 to 1,000 people will be killed or seriously injured in slips, trips and falls in their homes across Scotland next year and this year. So when we're in there, you know, these are people that, you know, perhaps will come into contact with the health service or other social care providers, but we can do work to support them. We can do shared assessments to help there. So that's adding value again, as well as those partners doing home fire safety visits and that type of activity for us. So this is a big part, I believe, of the future of the Scottish Fire and Rescue Service, and I think it's a great opportunity to improve outcomes, not just for us, but for other partners.
What I was just going to ask is, in these partnerships you've mentioned, what about the voluntary sector? How much engagement is there across the piece with the voluntary sector?
I would suggest that it's growing. I mentioned earlier about we have some challenges accessing some of the people that are perhaps less visible in society, and they just disappear. And there are some excellent connections with the voluntary sector. In my own previous area, within Tayside, the Angus voluntary sector, we had a partnership with those people. The Salvation Army, it was another organisation that we had partnerships with, and there's examples right across Scotland where there's good local partnerships. But I think what we need to do is have the ambition that it's a national service and we support partnership working with the voluntary sector, but most, in my experience, most voluntary work works particularly well at a very local level, and I see that being captured nationally, but particularly through these local plans that we have to develop through community planning.
Dr. Waters.
Chair. Just to thanks very much. I mean, just to say that, I mean, the local fire stations do a tremendous amount of charity work locally, but as well as doing that, certainly my intention and the board's intention that we will not be meeting in at the present time our headquarters in Perth. We will not be meeting in Perth. In September, we will have a meeting in the Northern Hub area. We will then, you know, meet in the west area and meet in the east area. When we're doing that, just by the dint of where people stay, they're probably going to have to stay the night wherever we're going. There'll be some of the board having to stay the night. It is our intention as a board to invite the local council to come along to a meeting, as well as the community councils, other voluntary organisations and business. Not for them to listen to what we've got to say, but for a short introduction for us to listen to what they've got to say, and provide them with a cup of tea and a biscuit, and have a regular,
sorry, full.
It's no, a regular discussion with them. And the glass, I mean, it's just that, you know, budgets are very tight, so it'll be a cup of tea and a biscuit. Matter of fact, we'll have a discussion about the biscuit.
Thank you. It's useful because I think voluntary sector, certainly, as you say, the more invisible people are very useful. At last, Colin.
No, it's okay. It's done.
You've not got a question now?
No, it's okay.
I feel I've wounded him. You must have a question. Surely you have a question. You have a question?
On a general fact, if there was one particular issue that you found since the very quick turnover from the previous regime to the new regime, what would it be, and how would you see the challenge the next year? What would, if there was one single aspect that you really had concerns about?
I think we'll just go along the panel and make that the final one.
For me personally, I think the likes that we had, since being appointed in September and Alice being appointed, there was a whole period where the Scottish Fire and Rescue Service was myself and Alice Hay. That was before the senior manager appointed, the board was appointed. We took the opportunity of looking at at the rest of Scotland, you know, go down, introduce ourselves so that people were aware about who we are and what we were trying to achieve. I think the one thing that I think we need to look at and continue to look at, and it came to me, and it's about how we tackle things in our rural communities, but it's not just about rural communities. When I was in Orkney and looked at a brand new fire station that Highlands and Islands had developed and was about to open, right opposite the old hut that they used to operate out of, to look at the hut next to our old hut and see the Coast Guard old hut, and round the corner the ambulance old hut that they still operated out of. And I thought, why are we not doing this better? Why are we not taking the opportunity to do this better? For very little, and probably a reduction in what Highlands and Islands had spent, we could have got something that accommodated that whole of that public sector within that area and gave something to that community that they could be proud of. So I think probably that would be the area that I'd want to look at. I'd want to look about how we provide, because any difficulty we have in the rural area, our colleagues have the exact same difficulty, and we must be able to do it better.
Mr. Hay, do you wish to?
This isn't something that came as a surprise to me, but the biggest challenge that we face is the people issues. I'm immensely proud to be a member of the Fire and Rescue Service. I'm absolutely delighted with the privilege to be the first Chief Officer of Scotland. But when I speak to people, irrespective of what role they play within the fire service, they're very proud to be part of it. They're very proud of what it represents and what it actually achieves, but they are feeling, as we mentioned earlier, uncertain. So I think that the biggest challenge really is keeping people on the journey of reform and making sure that for as many people as we possibly can, we give them a strong future whilst meeting those considerable financial challenges. And I think the partnership working is key to that. But people is where it all begins and ends for me.
Mr. Boyle.
I think being last to speak always lets you jot down 2 or 3 things, and there's probably a thread runs through them. I start off with communications, just keeping the message going out to people, and that is that aspect Alistair touched on there, just about people, and that element of reassurance that people need, the journey that you're on and how we're going to take them forward. I then moved on to visibility, and as a part of comms, and how do you show your leadership and being visible when you cover an area? And I'm being very selfish here. The West of Scotland, 13 councils, roughly about 4,000 staff in the area that I cover, 129 fire stations with various duty systems and all the rest, and a huge number of inhabited islands. So it's a big area, and there's me. There used to be 10 principal officers, so we need to then think about how I empower my teams to actually take on some of the mantle that used to be done by far more senior people than themselves. So there's a cultural change for people to take on roles they didn't necessarily have before, but to understand that this is a new entity that we're in, it's a new dynamic, and a situation that we're going to move forward in, and that we're all learning as we go. But the one thing that is at the heart is what Alistair said there, is the people issues. Keep the people inside. Ideas and policies are easy, but people make the difference, and it's keeping the people issues in terms of that in our sights.
I suspect that would be a useful mantra elsewhere, keeping the people on side without naming anyone in any group in particular. Can I thank you very much for your evidence? It's very useful and it's very cheering to hear for a change. I'm now going to move on to the next item on the agenda. Thank you very much. Can I ask members to turn to paper 2, please? And we're to item 3 in the agenda. This is consideration of the correspondence the committee has received regarding the offensive behaviour at Football and Threatening Communications Scotland Act 2012 and the policing of protests. Members will recall that at our meeting on 23rd April, the committee agreed that we write to a number of organisations on the function of the Act and policing of protests, and of course I've already referred you to paper 2. Can I have members' comments on the correspondence and whether we want to take any further steps at this stage? Graham.
Thank you, Convener. I note the content of the paper. I think in my own assessment of experience of this matter, the contents are myopic in the extreme. There is no evidence there, as we've heard over the last 6 months from solicitors who are concerned about people being routinely stopped at airports, going on family holidays because they're identified as supporters. Another group of solicitors who indicate that there's no doubt that supporters are routinely subject of surveillance, and there's whole issues around the application of RIPSA around that. Shrivel comments that we all are aware of, which even include the summary assessment of MINS in relation to the legislation. A promise that we received during the evidence before the Act was indeed empowered, a promise from the police that new legislation would put an end to the legal challenges faced due to the common law approach in relation to breach of the peace. But yes, we are still seeing challenges monthly. The Lord Advocate quite properly assesses that it's working very well from his perspective, and I've no doubt that administratively, in terms of managing cases, reporting them, prosecutions and convictions, that all adds up. But there's no indication of what the social consequences are or implications arising from the enforcement processes that have been applied. And finally, I would say in terms of the success rate in relation to the application of the legislation, analysis elsewhere indicates that nearly 3/4 of the complainers in respect of this legislation are police officers. One would expect a high level of successful prosecution thereafter. And I do think, taken together with the concerns that have been raised by various supporters groups, there is still real causes for concern, and we would do well to review the enforcement and processes that lie in connection with this Act sooner rather than later, in the interests of our communities, in the interests of involving those who feel the rough edge of this legislation.
I've got John, then I've got Sandra, please.
Thank you, Convener.
John Finney, then John Lamont, then Sandra.
Thank you, Convener. I would agree with much of what Graham said, not all of it. I don't think we need to be faced by legal challenges. The minute you have legislation, there will be challenges to it, and that's just part of the process. I found the correspondence illuminating in many respects, but I'm not, dealing with individually, the Lord Advocate stuff was very factual. We have the statistical information with some anecdotal beside it, which was I found interesting too, and would suggest that the group of supporters who certainly have approached me and others don't seem to predominate in those affected by the legislation. That said, I continue to hear the same things that Graham hears about people being stopped at airports and the concerns that fairly low-level or issues which on the surface don't appear to necessarily merit that level of intervention.
Not challenges, but where I just want to know the source of this, people being stopped at airports. I mean, I'm for facts and evidence, and I'd like to know where we could get that.
Paul Cavana from Gildays is the person who sourced the stopping of people routinely at airports, and Bill McCluskey was the solicitor who raised that there was no doubt solicitors are routinely subject of surveillance.
Which firm is this? Where is this? I just wanted to pick it up.
I've no idea.
Well,
we
so
can
we can follow this up. I think that's it. Yes, sorry.
Yep. What I would say in relation to the response by Chief Constable Mr House, I found that very compelling, that it was laid out, the assertions that were made, by and large, the sources of these, the fact that it wasn't backed up. However, whilst I found that very interesting, I certainly understood our committee's interest to be broader than the issue at the Gallowgate, and Mr House's response simply focuses on that. The concerns raised with me are that there's very vigorous enforcement of and challenges, particularly to young men, both around and within Celtic Park, regarding items of clothing they may be wearing, badges they may be wearing. And it is that issue that when I spoke previously I was concerned about, because legislation that seemed to disproportionately impact on one group and is viewed as such. That's the issue that needs to be addressed. So I wonder if the committee would be agreeable to writing Mr House, thanking him for that specific response in relation to the Gallagate, but asking about the general issues of application of that legislation, particularly with regard to application at Glasgow Celtic's football ground.
Yeah, I thought we took the view that the Gallagate was operational and that was a matter for the police, but that we're looking at the legislation really was what that was, rather than that particular to focus on that. John Lamont, yeah.
Thank you, Convener. I mean, I agree with what Graham Pearson has stated already. I just wanted to add just some figures really to back up what he was saying. I mean, the annual stats for the conviction rates for the new offences under this Act is 68%, compared to the overall conviction rate for all crimes, which is 85%. And I think the key point is the conviction rate for breaches of the peace is 86%. So the new Act, or the Act, has brought in an offence with a much lower conviction rate compared to what would have been happening under the old offence. I think it's also important to record that the statistics show that 259 people have been charged under Section 1 of the Act and only 20 charges under Section 6. So it just really was to reinforce Graham's point with those figures.
Sandra.
Thank you very much, Convener. The only letters that I've received, I think, are similar to other MSPs, and it's to do with the Green Brigade complaints. And whilst we're looking at, on the whole, as you've raised issues by two gentlemen who've never written to me, and I don't have written to the other, committee members or even any other MSPs. And John has raised certain issues, but mentioned it was basically a wearing of, garments outside a certain football ground. I'm not going to read out the letter that Steve House has replied in regards to, the questions that were asked. I mean, it is headed Green Brigade complaints. That's what he's headed as, and he's obviously assumed that this is the one issue which has kick-started, if you pardon the pun, the whole looking at this particular offensive behaviour at football and threatening communications bill. Now, I note the reply from Frank Mulholland, from Steve House, from the Minister also, and I also note that, obviously, I think we all know that this is to be reviewed, this piece of legislation, and I would certainly just stick by, the legislation being reviewed as was passed in the legislation. I wouldn't think we should be looking at an investigation into it so soon. But what I did want to quote was, and I think John Lamont had quoted some of these figures as well, 268 charges of offensive behaviour. This is the actual report that we have here. 99% of all charges were males. Under the age, 73.5% were under the age of 30, and basically under the influence of alcohol were 27.6% of the charges also. So there's other issues there as well, actually, about alcohol being linked, unfortunately, to football, offensive behaviour or violence, whatever you want to call it. And the pretty sad thing about it is coming from Glasgow and representing the constituency of Glasgow's 42.2% took place in Glasgow. And there were around certain football matches, and I'm not going to go on to say exactly what fixtures there were and the football matches that contained within it. There's obviously something that the legislation was brought out for a purpose. I think the legislation is working. I do think we should be looking at it, but not as soon as this. I think we should stick by the fact that there has been from the Minister a statement saying that we will look at this legislation in the future. Is it in 2 years' time, once it's been bedded in? And I think I would stick by that and would want to look at an investigation so soon in the Act being brought forward.
First of all, I want to say it's a pity, and I'll make sure next time you don't have a copy of my letter on your behalf to Chief Constable, because I'm reminded, if you look at page 8 of your paper, it was the correspondence outlining our concerns about the policing of the Green Brigade. So we actually asked for that. So in fairness, that's there. And next time I think it would be useful maybe if just have my letter that went out. I was reminded of that. I think that some issues have been raised which I'm not I'm not informed, I'm not disputing them or anything, but I think we should find out and we'd need these allegations that you've raised of stopping police at airports and solicitors being, as it were, targeted, with regard to the bill, the operation of the Act, I should say. If we can have the contact things, I think what we'll do is follow that up and ask for them for, so that we're all advised of that. It's only appropriate. Otherwise, we've just got members telling us, I'm not by any way disputing it, but sorry, John.
Well, I think, and firstly, apologies to Mr House if that's what the letter said. I understood, in line with what we had asked the Lord Advocate, it had been a broader request, but if that's what it certainly was a comprehensive reply and very informative, but I would nonetheless seek particularly the issues. Now, anyone who knows my allegiances, it isn't with this club. However, I do have people say to me, talk about this legislation, and whether there's any basis to saying people being stopped at the airport. Now, I have to tell you, if someone's broken the law and he's known to be at an airport coming or going, and it's an arrestable offence, I'm delighted if the police are doing that. However, this is more about the perception that there is a targeting. I certainly know nothing about the surveillance of solicitors. I'm not, if indeed that's been. But my point being, the young man who spoke to me last Thursday night in the north of Edinburgh, whilst I was at a meeting about that, I don't know his name. I've no cause to believe that it was anything other entered in good faith. But the fact that there are all these examples shows that we have something to address.
Problem about people, but that's just, we all must have the information before us. Now, this is now on the record. That we're having this discussion, so that anyone who wants to see and to look at the fact and say, we think that this is being misapplied or disapplied, I'm going to take you in a minute, then that's also there. But if anybody has any details or contacts of people making these allegations, it's appropriate that we then ask them to advise the committee of them so we can put them to the appropriate sources. I can't just do it on hearsay, John. I mean,
For the avoidance of any doubt, first and foremost, I'm not asking for anything other than clarification from the Chief Constable. If there is a different format applied to the policing of that particular ground as to elsewhere in Scotland now, perhaps it's a historic dimension from Strathclyde Police, I think that's important. There is an undertaking that the legislation is going to be reviewed. I accept that. My comments aren't about conviction rates or anything like that. They are about a public perception in some quarters about the disproportionate impact this has on a group of individuals.
We can ask him to comment on that, but what I'm saying is what's useful to the committee is if anybody has any information that they can give us contacts, and bring you in, Graham, sure. Then that we have that so that we can actually put it appropriately and it's not hearsay given to the committee and not first hand. Graham.
Just to clarify one point, the statement made by Bill McCluskey wasn't that solicitors were being subject of surveillance. It was no doubt supporters are routinely subject of surveillance. Second thing I would say is I mentioned about the usefulness of the legislation in terms of legal challenges. The only reason I raise that is it was a very strong part of the evidence in support of the introduction of this enactment, that from a police service viewpoint, the breach of the peace had lost its efficacy, and therefore there was a need for this new legislation, and it would then put it beyond challenge. And I think you might recall I offered some wide-eyed optimism in terms of that view. So I'm not suggesting for one moment I thought it would be beyond challenge for the future, but that was the very specific evidence from British Transport Police at the time. And the one other group that I'll mention is that you may remember that some supporters came through one Tuesday to the Parliament some weeks ago to proffer their case in relation to this legislation. It was part of the evidence that they gave when they arrived at the Parliament that they were subject of surveillance and indeed interviewed by the police at 10 o'clock in the morning in George Square before they even set off for the Parliament. And in their view, they found that somewhat challenging and indeed somewhat sinister from their viewpoint.
And RIPSA you've referred to, and if people have not applied the legislation, then that's something that should be acted upon.
Very much.
Absolutely.
That's the point I'm making.
Hold back. I've got Roderick, then Sandra. Roderick.
Yeah, I don't have very much to say that hasn't already been said, but I agree with you, Convener. There's a lot of anecdotal evidence. If we want to take this seriously, we need to have something on the record to consider. The only other point I think I make is obviously to refer to the fact that the Lord Advocate refers to his guidelines and to the fact that he hasn't received any kind of representations on suggested revisions, but would be happy to consider any suggested revisions. If we are going to look at any written submissions, we might wish to look at those guidelines too.
Sandra.
Thank you, Convener. I didn't know anything about supporters being in George Square when they were coming through to Parliament. I take it they obviously met there before they went to Queen Street Station, but you know, that'd be something I'd like to hear about, and maybe you know, speak to these supporters, because normally if you're going through to Edinburgh you just go to the train station and off you go. So I'd like to see exactly what happened in that particular one. But I do think it's important to quote some of the figures from Steve House's reply, because it was specifically asked about that situation in the Green Brigade. Now, Steve House tells us that 72 members of the public had made complaints. Then he goes on to say, of these, 34 have refused to engage with the police beyond their initial email, despite a number of attempts.
This is to do with the incident in the gallery.
Yes, because
I want to leave that one. I want to park that.
Chair, I think it's really important, because the letter was sent to Steve House under those auspices. And what I'm trying to say is, we have from MSPs, people who have contacted them, other MSPs haven't seen them. I'm just making the point. I'm making the point that of these 34 refused to give further evidence, and basically some of the people who were actually left to supposedly give evidence about the incidents and correspondence came from all over Scotland. They actually even came from Cyprus. So I'm just trying to put this into a context.
That's fine. It's in context, and it's also on our website, so it's in the public domain, that response. But what I want to deal with and focus on is the legislation. And the suggestion is that we're going to write to Chief Constable, pointing him to what we've already discussed here with issues of where we may think it's being misapplied. And what I would like from members is contact details for anyone who feels that they have direct evidence to the committee. We can't really pick this up until into the new year. You've got your work programme in front of you, but it doesn't mean it's parked. I mean, the last thing we want is legislation that is wonky in places. I'm not saying it is, but let's just check the position. But I can't allow... we can't proceed on the basis of, you know, comments made, worthy though they are, from Graham or John. We need something that the committee has in front of it, which it can then challenge. Might even have some people in to advise us, is this the case, and challenge them, test their evidence. John.
I would like the committee to make it very clear, if someone has a complaint of impropriety on behalf of the constabulary, they don't come to the Scottish Parliament, they present themselves at a desk, they make a complaint, and that's why Sandra's points are very valid, because in relation to that, I thought it was very compelling that people did make complaints to the police, wanted to make the assertion, and they didn't follow that up. Now, is that wasted?
We're not the last court of appeal. We never have been, and we never will be. We're not a complaints procedure, but we are entitled to look at the operation of legislation. I agree with you. So you made your points. You've all made your points.
Well, what I was going to say, if you could allow me, would be the fact that when you said you were writing to the Chief Constable saying there are areas perhaps that we think this Act is being misapplied, well, we don't know.
I never said that.
I think that was, you used the word think, and that...
It may be misapplied. I'm not claiming 1 minute it's being misapplied. It's just an allegation it's being misapplied. We don't have evidence to that. And you know, none of us would want to see anything misapplied, but I'm not claiming it. That's the whole point about calling for independent evidence from anyone outside, not as an appeal to us, but so we can consider the validity of what's being said. Again, put that to the Chief Constable if we must.
I come in and following up from what John says, you know, if people have a legitimate complaint, they should go to the first port of call, which is not the Scottish Parliament. It would be the police.
I've made that point.
Yes, but I wanted to carry on from that. So what we're suggesting is we write to the Chief Constable, Steve House, on the assumptions of people who have written to individuals that we think there's something wrong. You know, surely if these individuals think there's something wrong, they should write to the police first, and if it comes through, then we could look at it then.
I'm not, oh dear, I feel I'm going round in a wild circle here. All I will be doing on your behalf is writing saying that some allegations have been made. We are simply passing this information on. We are not doing anything about it just now because we don't have any independent evidence in front of us. But the record is there. I have no doubt the Chief Constable pays attention to what happens in this committee, particularly when these issues arise, notwithstanding the previous evidence session. And I think that that's all we're going to do. But if members have then it's up to people to write to the committee, not as a court of appeal, not as a complaints process, but to say, this is what happened with the legislation. We have to see whether, in fact, that's the case. These can all be passed to the police and ask them to comment. We will not be. Pass it to the police and let them comment in the first place. Can I move on now?
Yes.
I'm moving on, Rod. Unless it's crucial.
I just think we need to record something in relation to the incident in the Gallagate to say that we've read the correspondence and noted it, or have something for the record on that point.
Well, we have it. We've noted it. It's also the whole response is on the website. I mean, anybody can challenge that. It's there to be seen, as is this discussion. I'm moving on to item 4, purposeful activity in prisons. It's consideration of the government's response to the committee's report and inquiry into purposeful activity. The paper notes the Scottish Prison Service has agreed to provide us with the outcomes of organisational review and updates on its strategic review of purposeful activity when these become available. Can I just suggest we keep a watching brief on this issue? I think our investigation did have some impact, quite cheered up by the chief of the SPS now in his view. We also have the option of making a bid for a committee debate in the chamber, but you might want to wait an outcome of these reviews before we do it. So are you content with that just now? It's a watching brief.
Can I make one point?
Yes, do.
On page 11, item 10, about the movement of prisoners between prisons and courts, diverting staff resources. At the beginning of the answer it says, escort services are currently delivered by G4S, no impact on prison resources. The point we were making is that the reception area at the prison needs staff allocated to ensure that prisoners are prepared to leave the prison to go to the appropriate courts. And on return from the courts, there's all the security searches and so forth that is needed. So to say that there's no impact on prison resources is either a misrepresentation because of shorthand or misunderstanding. We're not talking about the escort part of it out in the street. It's that staff who might otherwise be engaged in doing purposeful support of prisoners are allocated to the reception areas for long periods of time, and that's what disrupts the prison. So it's just a point of information.
We've also made a point, put it down as a parliamentary question. And also, of course, as we now know, we're looking at perhaps video conferencing where we won't be requiring so much movement of prisoners backwards and forwards. Yes. So anyway, you can ask the parliamentary question about that as well as have it on the record. And I look forward to your question. Item 5, fatal road collisions. What do you want to do with this? Do you want to continue undertaking work on this issue, or whether we've taken the matter as far as we can? And I'm kind of mindful that I think comments were made by the Cabinet Secretary on the Victims and Witnesses Bill, that there were perhaps possibilities there. And we've got that debate, is it tomorrow? Wednesday. Which may be a time to make these points. Shall we, can I take your views on it? Yes, sorry, Jenny.
I wonder if we keep it open until after the bill has concluded, just since we've taken the evidence on it, and then make a decision, a quick decision after that.
I see in the note back from the Cabinet Secretary, page 5 of the papers, of your many papers on legacy sports papers, I'm not persuaded that it's necessary to give bereaved families a statutory right to obtain copies of the investigation papers relating to fatal road deaths, but given the concerns raised by the committee, I've asked my officials to discuss the matter with COPFIS to ensure that appropriate information is passed to families where possible. So he's not agreed to a statutory right, but I think it's an interesting point to raise at the debate tomorrow and see how that's in your papers.
I think as well, one of the points put to the Cabinet Secretary was not necessarily a right for the families to be given the information, it was perhaps a right to ask. And yes. I think that we can actually only probably take a decision on whether to close this off until after we've had the discussion and the debate on the bill.
Fine. And also you can raise that tomorrow, make the distinction, see if there's something that's available in the amendment process. Thank you very much. We're going to now moving into private session, I think, for 6 and 7. Thank you very much.